Here until the end.
Alear is required for every chapter, and their death means a game over, so what do they bring to the table? Well, their starting stats are enough to hold their own, but they won't be killing enemies in one round of combat without emblem support. Their growth rates, the percentage chance of each stat raising on a level up, mostly skew towards dexterity and speed, letting them hit reliably and double attack often, but their low strength growth holds them back from doing a ton of damage. What is notable though is their surprisingly high defense growth, especially in their default class, for an on-foot sword lord. Which is good for someone you need to keep alive, and someone who has great support abilities, such as their personal skill. Every character in Engage has one of these, and Alear's is divinely inspiring, which causes adjacent allies to deal +3 damage and take 1 less damage. This might not sound like much, but it's very useful, especially early in the game. On someone who's attacking twice, that's effectively +6 damage, and that's a lot. That -1 damage taken helps more than you think too. This skill is also nice because supports in Engage require units to be adjacent to get their bonuses, and Alear supports every character in the game. There's one more thing I'd like to draw attention to in Alear's base kit, because it's a very significant one. Their starting proficiencies. In Engage, what weapons you can use are dictated entirely by your class, but a character's proficiencies determine what classes they can reclass into. Every character starts with some, and can learn more through emblems. Alear's starting proficiencies are swords and punching, arts. Whatever you want to call it, this is huge, because without DLC, you don't get access to an emblem that teaches art proficiency until chapter 14. And this means Alear is one of only 3 characters until that point who has access to arts-based classes. An important note though, Alear's starting class, Dragon Child, is not one of these. They need to reclass in order to access them, but they are the only person with access to these reclasses for a very long time, and that in itself is a huge niche. So taking all that into account, what kind of unit is Alear? Well, they're not a powerhouse without emblem support, though they do have exclusive access to 1 emblem for the first 3 chapters, making them your best combat unit until chapter 4. After that, there are 2 directions people like to take Alear. The first is to patch up their strength growth and make them a stronger combat unit. A reclass to Wyvern Knight is generally used for this, as it also lets them fly. The other route is to make them more of a support unit. For this, you can either reclass them to a fist-based class, which has a special ability I'll be covering in chapter 2, that Alear makes excellent use of as it stacks well with their personal skill and supporting everyone. Or you keep them in their default Dragon Child and later Divine Dragon classes. These are unique to Alear and come with the Dragon unit type. The Dragon type gets unique benefits from every emblem in the game, and some of these, especially on the support emblems, are very useful. But moreover, this ensures Alear is a good user of every emblem, which makes them one of the most versatile members of the army, able to fill any role you need depending on the chapter. So, to those who want flexibility, I'd recommend keeping Alear in their default classes. To those who want more of an unparalleled support unit, I'd recommend reclassing to Key Adept. And for those who want the main character to be a combat powerhouse like they are in some other Fire Emblem games, I'd recommend Wyvern Knight. Overall, Alear is excellent for the first few chapters, but requires a bit of work and thought to do decently after that point. But as somebody you're forced to use, that work is worth it.
I am your shield.
Vander's job is to act as a crutch and bodyguard for your weaker characters in the early game, fading into the background once they've come into their own. Historically, Fire Emblem has had a problem balancing characters of this type, as they often end up a little too useful throughout the entire game, invalidating the characters they're supposed to prop up. Vander, however, is a return to form for the archetype, although some may say he succeeded a bit too well. Vander's starting stats are almost perfect, so that he weakens enemies without killing them, regardless of the difficulty you're playing on. This lets the lower level members of your army in the early game finish off these enemies to level up. Vander also has the best HP and defense of your army for a while, and his speed is just high enough that he doesn't often get doubled where it matters, making him an excellent tank for luring tough enemies into more manageable positions. And starting as a paladin, a promoted mounted class, means he has enough movement to get where he's needed too. Vander only uses axes, which is atypical of this archetype, which means his accuracy can suffer against faster enemies or those in cover, but Vander's main job is not to hit things, so I don't find this a huge problem. What can be a problem is, oddly, his personal skill. +5 crit to Alear is nice, but this also applies to Vander himself, and most of the time you really don't want Vander critting things, because if he does, he will kill them, and if he kills them, he gets almost no experience due to his massive internal level of 15. This is actually the main problem with Vander. His growth rates aren't that bad, but because he gains so little experience, by the time he does level up even once, the rest of your army will likely have surpassed him. And as I said before, this is the point of Vander, but it happens a little earlier than some players would like. For me, I tend to drop Vander around chapter 7 or 8. Vander is perfectly usable throughout the whole game if you like him. As I said, his growths aren't that bad. You just need to find a solution to his experience problem. But I've heard many say Vander is terrible just because he falls off early. He's amazing until that point, and I would highly recommend using him a lot. The early chapters are much smoother with him around.
Never underestimate me!
Clanne is the first mage you get, and regardless of whether you want to take him all the way, you will need him to defeat armor knights in the early chapters. The problem is, on the higher difficulties, his base magic is just 1 or 2 points off reliably two-shot killing them, and look at that base growth in magic. Clanne is somebody who clearly doesn't want to be a mage. If you get lucky with his 35% growth early on, he can become very reliable, but if you don't, and that's likely, you may need Alear's personal skill to fix up his damage. Speaking of which, Clanne's personal skill, Verdant Faith, gives him and Alear +10 to hit if they're adjacent. Neither of them have much trouble with accuracy, but it always sucks to miss a high hit rate, so added hit chance is always appreciated. If you want to use him in the long term, Clanne's main asset is having a pretty good speed growth for a mage, especially compared to the other ones you get early. Magic is very strong in Engage, and being able to reliably double attack with it makes for very good damage, even if your raw magic stat is not great. He also has a much higher base growth in strength than in magic. Combined with his starting proficiency in swords, the game clearly wants you to make him a Mage Knight, and that's not bad since Mage Knight is an excellent class in Engage. Just be warned though, that will change his unit type from mystical to cavalry, and so he'll lose the ability to ignore terrain with tomes. Beyond a bad magic growth though, Clanne's main weakness is starting at level 1, meaning it will take him a while to reach level 10, the earliest point you can promote, and by the time he gets there, some other mages will have joined who many like better than him. But Clanne doesn't have much competition for both being a mage and the first magical emblem we get in the early chapters, and that alone makes him worth using.
Me? Okay!
Framme is the first staff user we get, which is excellent not just for healing, but because Engage has a lot of utility staves. And due to the way weapon ranks are fixed according to class, Framme doesn't need to grind up her staff rank to use them. Being a key adept also gives her access to Chain Guard, a very useful mechanic for protecting allies that only 2 other people get access to until chapter 14, one of them being a reclassed Alear. Framme's personal skill, Crimson Cheer, gives plus 10 of Void to both her and Alear if they're adjacent. Don't worry though, this is the last personal skill that relies on Alear. But as it stands, this stacks well with Alear's personal skill and Alear being able to support everyone. Outside of Alear, Framme also happens to support a lot of very strong characters. This combined with an emblem obtained in chapter 11 that is excellent on key adepts, and her personal skill, makes Framme a very effective dodge tank with that build. If you do train her, Framme is notably in a 4-way tie for the highest base speed growth in the game, though her default class doesn't boost it further and Framme likes her default class, as it aids her utility and boosts her magic and resistance growth to a respectable 50% each. She also has an okay strength growth in this class, and that's relevant because arts actually scale their damage off the average of your strength and magic stats. Don't expect good things from Framme's combat for a while though. Most arts hit twice when initiating combat, but in the early game, Framme will only do 1 to 2 damage to most enemies. But that's no reason to write her off. Framme is not good because of combat, and she can level up just fine by using staves. Whether you want early game healing and chain guard utility, or late game chain guarding and evade tanking, Framme is your girl.
For you, anything.
Alfred leaves a bad first impression on a lot of players, but opinions have changed at least a little since Engage first released. Most expect a combat powerhouse from the first horse unit to join, and Alfred is meant to be more of a mobile tank, having decent base defense and HP and good growths in those areas. Alfred's base growths are overall very good, with nice HP and 40s in strength, speed, defense, and luck. The problem is, Alfred is very reliant on his high growths to get out of his bad starts, and said bad start gives him very mediocre offense that makes it hard for him to gain experience. His speed at level 5 is lower than Alear's was at level 1, and it's actually even worse than it looks, because his base build of 6 means every lance besides a slim one will weigh his speed down even further. And lances have lower might than axes, and Alfred's base strength is not amazing. His personal skill, I guess, kinda helps. Every time he uses weights without attacking or using items, he'll have +2 strength on his next turn. The idea behind this is you're meant to use Alfred as a tank, moving him into range of enemies then ending his turn, so that he gets that +2 strength to hit the enemy on the counterattack. But he's still a little weak, and you might think he has a niche in breaking enemy sword users, except we gain 2 arguably better lance users in the next chapter. Still, if you're able to feed some kills to Alfred to get him off the ground, maybe using Marth's Mercurius if you can raise the bond level that high, Alfred ends up as a pretty good mobile tank who can make decent use of support emblems. Especially the chapter 11 one if you're using a cavalry heavy party. Being one of the royals, Alfred has access to an exclusive promotion. Avenir, excuse my terrible French, is a 6-move cavalry class that can use lances and swords in a game where paladins are locked to a single weapon type. Its skill, learned at level 5, has a dex % chance of halving physical damage, aiding in Alfred's tanking abilities. The problem with this class is most people prefer paladin. Its defense won't be much lower, but its speed is a lot higher, and that's something Alfred really needs. Overall, Alfred has trouble getting out of his start, and by the time he does, arguably better options are available. However, if you like Alfred, he's definitely usable.
Etie here, busting in once again.
I find Etie very similar to Clanne. As he's your first mage whose job is to kill armors in the early chapters, she's your first archer whose job is to kill flyers in the early chapters. Her base stats are good enough to one-shot the flyers in chapter 3 even on maddening. Aside from this, Etie's main asset is her strength. Her base strength is good and it's her best growth. Her personal skill improves her strength even further, though it requires her to spend a turn not attacking, and for an archer this strong, that might not be what you want. Of course, it also runs through your stock of items, and Engage is a game where money is very tight, so that might be something else to keep in mind. Etie's biggest weakness stat-wise is her build. It's so low she loses speed from nearly every bow, even a basic iron one. If you're not careful, Etie can get doubled by enemies in the early game, and she's not exactly a paragon of defense and HP, so that's not good. Etie's only starting proficiency is bows, which makes her default promotion Sniper. It retains her covert type, but I feel Etie benefits less from evade tanking and more from raw damage. So I'd recommend picking up additional proficiencies to promote her to either Bow Knight for its extra movement and access to more weapons, or Warrior for its higher strength and ability to chain attack with longbows. That alone is excellent. We don't get another archer until chapter 7, and if you train Etie, she'll likely have more strength than them by that point. But this other archer requires less investment to work, so it's a trade-off. Enemies are strong enough in Engage that chip damage from archers is very valuable, so you can't go wrong by using one. And Etie's early utility plus good strength might make her your archer of choice.
Need some help? I'll take this!
Boucheron is your first backup unit, and backup classes are very good in Engage for their ability to use chain attacks. And this is the first thing you need to know about Boucheron. Even if you don't plan on training him at all, he is still worth deploying in the early chapters entirely for chain attacks. They are that good, trust me. Being an axe chain attacker is also a bonus, because if you equip a hand axe, you can chain attack enemies from 2 range, and you just so happen to get a free hand axe in the next chapter. Boucheron's personal skill is a little weird. It makes him deal +2 damage when an ally chain attacks in his combats. This skill is great in theory, as, like I said, chain attacks are incredible. The problem? Boucheron is the only chain attacker you have for the next 7 chapters. And yes, I counted. So until that point, Boucheron essentially has no personal skill. But it can be very good on a chain attack heavy party if you want to train Boucheron. So what does training him get you? Well, Boucheron's growths are so atypical that I've had to rescale my growth chart. His HP is massively overkill. And his defense growth of 40% is fairly solid for an axe fighter. But he doesn't sacrifice dex and speed either. In fact, Boucheron has the highest dexterity base growth in the game. But this comes at a cost. His strength growth, despite a good base, is very mediocre for a physical unit. He's meant to make up for this with his high speed and very good natural build growth, letting him consistently attack twice with heavy, powerful axes. That said, Boucheron suffers from success a bit when it comes to how good his chain attacks are. Because you want to use him to set up chain attacks, he rarely gets the killing blow on enemies, and unlike Awakening, support attackers don't gain experience. So it can be hard to level him up. If you do, I'd recommend getting him bow proficiency ASAP so he can promote to warrior. Yes, I have just recommended 2 people in warrior back to back, and that should show you that warrior is one of the best classes in Engage. It makes Boucheron's chain attack utility even better by letting him chain attack from 3 range with longbows. You could also pick up sword proficiency and make him a hero, a class whose chain attacks hit twice. Boucheron's a slightly awkward unit, but he's alright if you want to train him, and if you don't want to, I still recommend using him just for chain attacks.
It's tea time!
Despite sharing a class name with Alfred, Celine's version of Noble is a unique mystical class that can also use swords. She's your only magical source of damage outside of Clanne at this point, and depending on how Clanne's been doing, she might be a more reliable armor killer. While she can use swords, they're more useful if you just really need to break an axe user. Most of the time, it's much better to attack with her magic, though when you have access to the magical Levin sword, she makes great use of that. One thing about Celine is, even though her HP and defense are not amazing, she tends to be a little bulkier than Clanne on average, and sometimes a mage you can afford to expose to one enemy is useful. Speaking of Clanne though, Celine does suffer from a similar problem. Her magic growth in her base class is just as unreliable as his is. But her base magic growth is much higher than his, so she can reclass to a more magic focused class like Sage or Mage Knight to pump up that stat more. She also has an oddly overkill luck stat that I don't personally find useful for much, but it's something. Her personal skill increases the recovery that healing items provide, and in early chapters when your main source of healing is vulneraries, that's actually more useful than you think. Celine's unique promotion is Vidam, an on-foot mystical class able to use swords, tomes, and staves. Access to staff utility within a Lord class is very nice. And this class also provides a helpful small boost to her strength and magic growths, which is probably to make better use of its skill, Ignis. Yes, you may remember this skill if you played Awakening. It has a dex % chance of adding half your strength to magic attacks and half your magic to physical attacks. Celine's dexterity isn't really high enough to make this reliable though, and she has a -2 to her stat cap in that area. But not many classes have access to Levin swords, tomes, and staves, which would be the main reason to use Vidam. That, and it's the only playable mystical class that can use swords, which gives it some strange synergy with Marth and Sigurd. Marth letting her use a magical Lodestar Rush with a forged silver blade, and Sigurd letting her use Override with a Levin sword while also dealing damage equal to 25% of her magic stat. If you don't care about that though, Celine can easily become a more conventional magic class and might do better there. Most of the time, I find Celine a more reliable magic user than Clanne, but there are other magic users that join later who may be even better. Still, Celine is perfectly usable.
May we all be protected.
At last, the one true savior of armor knights has arrived. Not exactly. Louis went the opposite direction to Alfred. I think people overvalued him in the early days of Engage's release, and people look at him more critically now. As an armored unit in Engage, Louis has the same movement as other foot classes, and is immune to break via the weapon triangle. He also has incredible base defense and HP, so high that most physical enemies are not a threat to him. This makes Louis one of the only characters who can waltz into a horde of enemies and deal significant damage to them on the enemy phase, a rare niche in Engage. But with a base resistance of 1 and enough speed to almost guarantee being doubled, he needs to stay far away from mages. Chain attacks are also a concern, but aside from that, he can take on physical enemies for days, and he'll gain a lot of experience with this. So what does leveling up do for him? His growths might look lopsided, but in practice, he has high growths in all the stats he wants, HP, strength, and defense, and low growths in stats he doesn't care about, speed, resistance, and luck. My only gripe is, despite an okay base dexterity, his growth can suffer in that department. You may need to inherit some hit plus skills onto him from Sigurd to keep his accuracy reliable in the late game. Speaking of which, Louis and the Armor Knight class in general do drop off in usefulness towards the later chapters, where stronger enemies that can consistently double him start appearing. This drop-off happens even faster on Maddening mode, where many players stop using him after chapter 12 or so. Not helped by the fact that Maddening enemies will not attack someone if they'll do 0 damage. Despite this, Louis is still very useful for the early chapters, and on normal or hard, is quite useful for the whole game. Oh yeah, there's also his personal skill. -2 damage is nice, but in practice, Louis is so tanky he doesn't need this often anyway, and getting 2 females adjacent for it can be impractical. It's a little easier to activate if you have a female Alear, so that may be a reason to pick that gender.
Is it go time?
There are many constants in Fire Emblem. The main character's parents die, and the first flyer you get is amazing. Chloe is an example of the latter. Chloe is a very typical Pegasus Knight, having excellent dexterity and speed, along with good resistance. Her job is meant to be a mobile mage killer, but it's not too difficult to make her a mobile everything killer. Her build is a little low, but her speed is so high she can often double while weighed down. She just needs a bit of help with her strength to consistently one-round enemies, but we'll be getting access to a side chapter that provides a +2 strength stat booster very soon, and she is one of the best candidates for that item. But wait, someone who needs just a little more damage to reliably one-round enemies? Yes, Chloe also makes excellent use of Marth's Emblem. Not only for offense, but also for snowballing her level with Mercurius, and as a flyer, she's one of the better characters to snowball. Chloe also has a bizarrely high HP growth for a Pegasus Knight. It's as good as Louis', and he's meant to be a tank. And her personal skill provides +2 damage if a male and female ally are adjacent within 3 spaces. Now this sounds good, but as a flyer, I find Chloe is usually so far ahead of the rest of the army that she's not triggering this skill often. But still, a damage boosting personal skill is great for someone like her. Get her some levels, or a lot with Mercurius, and Chloe will be a physical powerhouse in the early game. But what I find interesting is that her role tends to pivot around the halfway point. You may notice that her strength growth is lower than her magic, and she has a starting proficiency in staves. What tends to happen is around halfway through, Chloe's strength falls off, but her magic starts getting higher. The game likely intends you to promote her to Griffin Knight at this point, and pivot her into more of a support role with staves. Here's the thing though, magic swords exist. If you promote her into a sword Griffin Knight, she can continue to maintain excellent offense by using Levin swords instead of physical weapons. And with the low resistance on most enemies, her offense will likely be even better than it was before. So yeah, Chloe is an excellent character and someone well worth investing early resources into.
This is how I save lives!
Jean is the aptitude trainee of Engage, a character who starts at level 1 with low base stats but high potential. And he is a fantastic idea for this archetype, because unlike others, he starts as a healer. This means Jean can immediately contribute with healing, utility staves, and Chain Guards, being the final member of the Chain Guard trio until Chapter 14, even at his base level with no investments. So even if you don't like trainee units, Jean has value just for that. But if you're like me and you do like raising trainee units, Jean improves on the archetype by having his personal skill double the growth rates provided by classes, letting him excel in a wide variety of roles, both physical and magical. If you want to go for a physical class though, I recommend waiting to level him until you get second seals, which often means putting off his paralog until then. Remember that you can do paralogs at any time after they unlock. I normally recommend leveling people to 10, promoting them, and then using a second seal in Engage. Physical Jean is an exception, because starting at level 1 means he won't have a high internal level if immediately reclassed, so he'll still gain the same experience as a normal level 1 would. and swapping to a physical class immediately will give him the maximum benefit out of a high strength growth. But personally, I like to use Jean in magical classes. This saves you a second seal, and means that you can keep him for his first 10 levels as a martial monk, letting him level up very easily off of staves and the Chapter 6 emblem while still providing utility. And his innate tome proficiency gives him access to Sage, Martial Master, and High Priest without any help from emblems. Though I'd personally still pick up sword proficiency for Mage Knight, because Jean does very well in that class as it boosts the speed growth. Here's the thing with Jean, only his class growths are doubled, and most classes have very lopsided stat growths, which means if you're not careful, Jean's stats can get very lopsided. Case in point, I made him a Sage in my first playthrough, and he ended up with overkill magic and resistance, but problems with his speed. Overall, I think Jean is one of the best designs for a trainee unit Fire Emblem has ever had. Being fun to customize and watch grow if you like that kind of thing, while also being a viable support character with no investment if you don't.
Hey there! Look what you made me do.
It's that mysterious wanderer, Yunaka! So back in Chapter 5, I mentioned that Thief is more of a combat class than a utility one in Engage, and Yunaka exemplifies this. She has good dexterity and enough speed to double attack most things, especially when her weapons are so light, fairly decent bulk for someone so fast, one extra point of build over her class's typical base, and a base strength that might seem a little low, but bear with me. Her personal growth rates are pretty solid in everything except defense, and her class boosts them to a respectable 45% strength and great 60% speed and dexterity, alongside a 50% resistance growth, letting her act as a mage killer at high levels. Her personal skill, Trained to Kill, which does not imply anything about her backstory at all, gives her plus 15 critical whenever she's in terrain with an avoid bonus, which synergizes extremely well with Thief being a covert class and receiving double terrain avoid. With this, Yunaka's intended playstyle is sitting in terrain, dodge tanking all incoming enemies, and obliterating them in return with crits. Though it's not until you have access to critical boosting emblem engraves that she truly excels at this. And it should be noted this is much better on normal and hard than it is on maddening, where enemies will ignore characters they have zero chance to hit. All of that seems pretty good, but what really makes Yunaka an excellent character in the early chapters is knife forges. Knives are incredibly cheap to forge, and the return on your investment is huge. With an early forge, Yunaka will obliterate most enemies for the next few chapters, even on maddening. And the few she doesn't kill are easy to finish off due to being poisoned. Alternatively, you can give her Marth's emblem, and then she kills basically everything. Starting as a thief, though, is both Yunaka's biggest strength and weakness, because thieves are a special class and so need to reach level 21 before they can reclass to second tier classes with second seals. Yunaka's good default growths, especially in magic, imply she would be great reclassed, and this holds back that potential a bit. For that reason, and enemies being tougher, Yunaka tends to fall off in the mid to late game on maddening mode, but she's still excellent early on, and on normal and hard, she's viable for the whole game.
Wanna win next time? Have I got just the thing for you?
One look at these growth rates should tell you that Anna is a very weird unit, but that aside, she is a backup unit by default who can use hand axes, and that alone makes her a nice filler for chip damage on bosses. Her base stats are pretty comparable to Boucheron aside from build, and while he's been around longer, there's no reason not to use both as filler. In fact, I once brought an untrained Anna and Boucheron to Chapter 10 on Maddening mode, entirely because chain attacks are so good. I just wanted to bring that up because a lot of people who hate investment units dismiss Anna when she has decent utility even at base. But it is important to remember that Anna is very much an investment unit if you do want to use her, and that's not for everyone. So what do you get out of it? Somebody weird, but potentially good in a few niches. Firstly, Anna's personal skill. This gives her a luck % chance of getting you 500 gold every time she kills an enemy, which is utility nobody else in the army can provide in a game where gold is very tight. But in practice, with her base luck of 3, it takes a long time before Anna can reliably trigger this. So what else does Anna offer? Well, she starts as a physical class, but has a 50% personal growth in magic, the highest personal magic growth in the game. Alongside a 50% personal speed growth, you're kind of meant to reclass Anna to something like Sage, Mage Knight, or some people like to go High Priest to boost her luck growth for her personal skill. She's theoretically your strongest mage when trained, but in practice it takes a while for her to grow out of her low base magic. In my opinion, the best use for Anna is to not bother with the reclass, and simply promote to Warrior off of her default proficiencies in bows and axes. Warrior, as I've said many times, is a fantastic class in Engage. It has access to chain attacks with longbows, but more importantly for Anna, it has access to the Radiant Bow, which is a magic bow with an insane 19 attack power. You get your first guaranteed Radiant Bow in Chapter 14, which is a while off, but you can turn a silver bow into a Radiant Bow at the Forge, and Anna arguably makes a good case for an early Radiant Bow. With her good magic, she's able to one-shot a lot of dangerous flyers like Wyvern Knights, at a point where not a lot of people can. And she can assist with chain attacks when that's not necessary. She needs to level up 5 times to reach Warrior, but that can easily be done through Micaiah's Great Sacrifice. Overall, Anna is a very strange unit, and not for everyone. But there are 2 deals she offers. A gimmicky but strong late game mage for a lot of investments, or chain attack utility and a strong Radiant Bow warrior for less investments.
It's me, the Brodian prince who isn't Diamant.
Alcryst, you don't need to feel bad about yourself, buddy. I'm going to give you a mostly glowing review. If you want an archer on your team and haven't trained Etie, Alcryst can slot in pretty easily with his decent base stats and starting level of 10. He's good enough to do what an archer needs to do, killing flyers right from the start, while also being surprisingly tanky for an archer. He has a +1 defense cap for a reason. His personal skill is also very nice. If he accompanies your main forces, it's easy for him to have this up every turn, and +3 strength makes him a deceptively heavy hitter. In terms of growths, Alcryst has incredible dexterity, good speed and HP, and decent strength and defense. The biggest notable thing about Alcryst is that, being a royal, he gets an exclusive promotion. A promotion he can access immediately if you're so inclined, although Master Seals are in very high demand at this point. The class's name sounds flashy, but it is literally just French for sniper. But that's fitting, as it's basically just sniper, except with objectively better base stats and a better skill. Yes, for some reason Luna is a character-specific skill in Engage, but ignoring half the enemy's defense, or resistance if you're using a Radiant Bow, will increase Alcryst's damage output significantly, and he has the dexterity to pull this off relatively consistently at high levels. If he's using a Brave Bow, or a certain Engage attack, it's not hard to trigger Luna at least once. But personally, what I like even more about Alcryst's personal class is that it's covert type, making him an excellent lure and dodge tank on normal and hard, and potentially invincible to some enemies on maddening. He can even do some damage to one-range enemies with a mini bow this way. Overall, Alcryst is a solid archer who doesn't need a lot of investment, and can be quite strong later on once he gets a Luna build going. And now, His future wife, Lapis.
Ooh.
I'm not a shipper at all.
I'll cut you down to size.
Okay, I'm biased towards Lapis as a character, but I fully admit she's not amazing. But she does have some things going for her. Firstly, she is, again, a backup class by default, making her excellent filler, especially if you haven't trained Boucheron or Anna at this point. Her base stats will certainly be better than those two by now. In fact, they're serviceable for her to contribute well in combat for the whole Brodian arc if you have a free deployment slot. Deployment slots only become really tight right after Brodian, and by that point some powerful pre-promotes join who can easily replace Lapis, so I find it doesn't hurt you much to use her for this arc. But if you like her and want to use her the whole game, what does she offer? Well, mostly speed. Lapis is one of those in the 4-way tie for best personal speed growth in the game. Combined with her good base speed, her speed stat can easily reach overkill levels, and this is a blessing in disguise as it allows her to do one of two things. Either go into an even faster class like Wolf Knight to maintain doubling thresholds even on the fastest enemies, or use a class or emblem to patch up her strength, letting her hit fast and hard. This is my favourite direction for her, either through a reclass to Wyvern Knight or with the emblem we get in Chapter 8. But there are other classes that work on her. It costs a second seal and some emblem leveling, but she makes a better thief than Yunaka. Her personal growth in magic lets her work as a Griffin Knight, and if you want a mix of offense and support, she can quickly pick up lance or axe proficiency and go hero for 1 to 2 range chain attacks and brave assist. And starting at level 10 means that Lapis can get into one of these classes pretty much as soon as you want. You might notice that I haven't mentioned Swordmaster. The game clearly intends this to be her canon promotion, but I don't think Swordmaster is a very good class in Engage. Hero is basically the same thing but better. Overall, Lapis has overkill speed and shaky but fixable offenses, which may be fitting because her fellow retainer is the exact opposite. Oh right, I forgot to mention her personal skill. It's strange because while the -10 crit seems like a bad thing, this skill rarely holds me back whenever I use Lapis. In fact, she has an odd tendency to be a crit machine for me in spite of it. The bonus to hit rate is nice since having 100 accuracy is fairly rare in this game.
Allow me to dazzle you.
Finally, someone who starts as a mage and actually wants to be one. In both her base stats and growth rates, it should be clear what Citrinne's theme is. Titanic magic and resistance, but somewhat lacking speed. Emphasis on only somewhat lacking though. The thing with Citrinne is her speed is just low enough to still be fixable, and Engage has a lot of tools to fix speed. There's Mage Knight and its class skill, there's certain emblems, tonics, meals, and even bond rings. Bond rings deserve special mention because Citrinne makes great use of a few of them, namely Olwen, May, and Lilina. She also starts at level 10 and has staff proficiency innately, letting her instantly promote to Sage for even stronger magic and staff utility. I said Master Seals are in high demand now, but Citrinne makes a good case for one. But speaking of seals, there's another weird build that Citrinne can also go for, reclassing to Sniper. Her personal base in magic is high enough to immediately put out great damage with a Radiant Bow. And this combos well with an emblem obtained later on. You may notice I haven't mentioned her personal skill. It's pretty good in theory, giving a reciprocity effect to healing items. The problem is, every turn Citrinne spends using a healing item is a turn she's not spending annihilating enemies' faces off with magic, so kinda feels like that's using her wrong. From my observations of discussion around this game, Citrinne was very undervalued early in Engage's lifetime, but she's lately been reevaluated far more positively, and I can definitely see why.
My legend starts now!
Amber is interesting. Firstly, his base stats are about the same as Alfred's average stats at level 11, so that's a shame for Alfred fans. But what's notable about Amber is his very high strength. A personal base of 9 is the highest we've seen so far, and is one of the highest in the game overall. He's also tied for the best strength personal growth outside of DLC. His other decent growths are defense and luck, but his speed and dexterity can be a bit lacking. The plus 20 hit from his personal skill can help with this, though both himself and the enemy need to be essentially isolated for it to work. So Amber hits hard, but has difficulty double attacking. What can we do about this? Well, one common answer is to reclass him to Halberdier. Its class skill lets you automatically double attack if there's another ally adjacent to that foe, though this does ruin Amber's personal skill. The other, and possibly more fun approach is, sure, Amber doesn't double, but it doesn't matter because he only needs to hit you once. This involves reclassing to something with high strength like Warrior, watching Amber's strength growth go bonkers off of his already good base, forging up a very strong weapon like a Great Axe, inheriting Vantage from Leaf and maybe a critical boosting skill from another emblem. Vantage works with smash weapons, by the way. And laughing maniacally as Amber one-shots anything that dares attack him. It takes a little to get this going, but not as much as most investment units. There is another character who joins later who can fulfill this role a little better than Amber, but there's no reason you can't use both. Overall, Amber's enormous strength and not much else makes him a one-trick alpaca, but a surprisingly deadly alpaca. That's a weird sentence, but it fits because Amber's weird.
Nothing short of victory.
You've met the Brodian Prince who isn't Diamant, now it's time to meet the Brodian Prince who is! Out of the gate, Diamant has great HP, strength, dexterity, speed, and defense, making him an excellent offensive and defensive all-rounder, and can also contribute chain attack support due to his version of Lord being a backup class. And having 50% growths in strength, speed, and defense, alongside a huge 90% HP, looks very appealing. In my first playthrough, Diamant was a combat monster for the next 3 chapters, one-rounding everything he fought and never dying, and that performance made me use him for the whole game, and then the issues started to show. The first thing you should know about Diamant is while his overall base stats look high, most of that comes from his personal class. His personal bases are more comparable to Lapis. It was just the low bases of Swordfighter holding her back. So while he may seem like an objectively better version of her who joins only 1 chapter later, in practice they fill similar roles of being chain attack support who can also fight. The second thing to know about Diamant is his dexterity is awful. His base value there is good, but with his low growth and the horrendously low stat cap of his personal class, Diamant has some major issues with accuracy later on, which is only exasperated by axes being his only good ranged option. Plus 15 hit from his personal skill does help a bit, but it only works if the foe has full HP and are able to counter, discouraging Diamant from going after archers in melee or anything else with a tomahawk. His unique promotion gives him access to axes for ranged chain attacks, buffs up his speed and defense growths by 5, which is nice, and in contrast to his brothers Luna, has Soul as its class skill. You'd normally think a healing skill would work great on someone as tanky as Diamant, but it has 2 huge problems. First, it activates based on Diamant's horrendous dexterity stat. Second, self-healing has negative synergy with the best tanking emblem in the game, an emblem that would otherwise suit Diamant's playstyle. Overall, Diamant is incredible when he first joins, but suffers major drawbacks in the long term. He can still be a decent mix of attacker and physical tank, but you will need to work around his dexterity.
I challenge you. Face my iron wall.
I don't like stealing from other YouTubers, but I'm gonna have to paraphrase actual Lizard's thoughts on Jade because they sum it up perfectly to me. Jade is meant to be Louis, but with more speed and resistance. The problem is it's not enough speed to avoid getting doubled, and it's not enough resistance to do well against mages. Her personal skill tries to help with this, but in practice, +2 resistance isn't gonna save her most of the time. So in practice, Jade has all of Louis' weaknesses, but less strength, HP, and defense. I also don't like that she's an axe armor rather than a lance armor. Axes are inaccurate enough that she can struggle to hit things even with her good dex base and growth. Another problem with Jade shows itself on Maddening mode. She joins right at the point where generals stop being good there, as from here on out, enemies will get stronger and stronger and their defense just can't keep up. The best defense quickly becomes a good offense, and generals don't do that well. However, on lower difficulties she's still fine, and Jade does at least have better reclass potential than Louis does. Thanks to her actually existing magic growth, she can go Griffin Knight if you want, or she can even become a very bulky Sage or Mage Knight, though not a very fast one by a long shot. There are many other viable reclass options. The problem is there isn't much Jade can do with those that other people don't do better. Still, Jade is perfectly usable on normal or hard if you like her design and personality, and I do. On Maddening though, I would recommend a reclass.
I will atone. For Illusia.
Ivy is a very interesting character. She has some significant flaws that take a bit of investment to overcome, but most consider this worth it as no one else can do what Ivy does. Namely, being a flying offensive mage who also has staff utility. Ivy's base stats are quite good, especially in magic, and her growths don't look good on paper, but they're enough to do what she needs. Now on to those flaws that needed compensating. First is her speed. As I said with Citrinne, there are a lot of ways to fix speed in Engage, and we just got one of them, Emblem Lynn. Ivy really likes Lynn, or at least inheriting Speed Taker from her. The problem is, Lynn is a very high demand emblem, but Ivy is arguably one of her best users. Her other issue is her dexterity. Her base is good, and most tomes have a high enough hit rate for it not to be a big deal. But later on in the game, her growth and negative cap will come into play, and she might start missing a bit. But just like speed, there are ways to fix this. You can inherit Hit Plus from Sigurd, if you had one, but that Divine Pulse skill we saw back in Chapter 10 would also help. Maybe we'll get access to it soon. And if all else fails, there's also her personal skill, which gives her +20 hits against any enemy she fights twice in a row. Ivy also joins at a point where base SP gets very significant. 1000 is already enough to get some great skills, and it's only one expert book off getting Speed Taker from Lynn, something you can theoretically do now if you're patient with the well and skirmishes. Ivy's unique promotion is really just her base class but better, but as she's one of the few royals who really wants to stay in their base class, that's enough. At level 5, it learns its skill Grasping Void, which has a dex% chance of dealing damage equal to half the foe's magic when using a tome. This is meant to let Ivy act as a mage killer, but in practice it's far from reliable. But 10 base magic is very good for a class, and it's one of the few to have access to S-rank tomes and B-rank staves at the same time. And this with a flyer's mobility is incredible. Ivy can get into tricky locations and use support and status staves, or hunt down and destroy targets with magic. Like I said, there's no one else who does what she does, and that alone makes her a worthy choice for investments.
Give me work.
Zelkov is a thief with very high base stats, while inferior to Yunaka in terms of resistance. He is far stronger in most other respects on average. His personal skill, not quite, gives him essentially 10 more avoid on the enemy phase. And now that I've covered it, I can stop talking like him. If Yunaka is starting to fall off at this point, or if you never used her and you want a thief, and thieves are pretty good, Zelkov makes a great addition. But what I find most interesting is the aforementioned very high bases, especially 5 base build. That's something not a lot of people have. This makes Zelkov very effective in a variety of reclasses, but he has the same problem as Yunaka. Thieves can't reclass to second tier classes until they reach level 21, which means he needs to be trained at least 4 levels in Thief before you can do that. Honestly, that's not too far off, and it's not as if his combat is bad until then. Just like Yunaka, I highly recommend making use of knife forges for Zelkov. But overall, apart from resistance, Zelkov starts good, has good potential, and can instantly slot into a team.
Precision and power.
Oh, Engage, you were doing so well with character balance, and then you just had to birth this guy. I'll give time for this bio to sink in, so you realize you're not hallucinating those bases and growths. Yeah, those base stats are absolutely disgusting. Like, look at that luck! 13 personal base luck! And over 20 dex and speed, good strength, and amazing base defense for a Swordmaster. 3 base build too. And then they gave him some of the best growth rates in the game. His personal skill effectively gives him plus 10 accuracy on the player phase, and he only has an internal level of 15, so he has no problems leveling up at this point. Kagetsu is so absurdly overpowered that not using him is effectively a challenge run. If you're new to Maddening, I'd highly recommend him. He makes the experience a lot easier. One tiny thing I want to add, just as proof that Kagetsu is ridiculous, there are some who consider him a better mage knight than most characters who start as mages. Yeah. He does have one major weakness though, and it's part of why I don't like using DLC. Kagetsu really wants a reclass. He is considered the best Wyvern Knight in the game, but he's perfect in almost anything except Swordmaster. As I've said before, it's not a great class in Engage. And here's the problem, his only default proficiency is swords, and he joins right after we lose most of the emblems, and Lynn and Lucina can't teach him anything except bows. That's not going to bring him closer to Wyvern Knight. After chapter 13, we'll get an emblem that teaches axes. But this means that without DLC, Kagetsu is stuck in an inferior class until then. And I like that, because that's one of the few drawbacks he has.
Fogado here, captain of the Sentinels. Better be ready.
It's time for Prince Fogado to get this party started. And now that we know he's a prince, I can say that he has a unique class like the other royals. His is a mounted archer. And his stats complement that decently well. He's in the 4-way tie for highest personal speed growth in the game. His strength is a little low, but that's always fixable. His solid resistance lets him act as a mage killer, but most interestingly is his decent base magic and okay growth for a physical unit. Which, as we've established, is pretty good on a bow user thanks to the Radiant Bow. When the game first released, most players stuck Fogado in Warrior without thinking, but as time went on, they realized the value of his personal class. Fogado is a high movement archer with enough magic to one-shot flyers with a Radiant Bow, and enough speed to quadruple attack with a Brave Bow. Not many characters can do both, and few do it with as little investment as Fogado. All he really needs is a Master Seal. And speaking of which, oh wait, I guess I have to talk about his personal skill. I don't like this. -10 crit sounds nice against a high crit foe. The problem is, it only works if you've already taken a hit from them anyway. I don't see the point of this. But okay, the Master Seal. Fogado's upgraded class, Cupido, gives him +2 to magic and raises his magic growth, helping out that Radiant Bow build even more. Its class skill at level 5 is Back at You, which gives Fogado a dex % chance of adding the amount of damage he just took to his counterattack damage. While this can be good, Fogado is not someone who wants to take hits. He wants to zip around the battlefield picking off priority targets with Radiant and Brave bows. And if you need someone who can do that, definitely give him a shot.
Come on, let's do this!
After Kagetsu, they clearly learned their lesson and wouldn't give us another ridiculously busted pre-promote. Oh wait! Pandreo is often described as Magic Kagetsu. He joins in a promoted class with very good base stats, enough to double and one-round a lot of foes with magic, along with some excellent staves in his inventory, warp especially. Good growth where it matters, especially his high personal speed growth for a mage, and an incredible personal skill, boosting his hit and avoid equal to 3 times the number of allies and foes within 2 spaces. This means Pandreo can dodge tank in rough terrain really well. It also combos very nicely with a later Lucina skill. Pandreo also has very good build for a tome user, making him even speedier. Just like Kagetsu though, Pandreo is pretty wasted in his base class. He really wants to go to an offensive magic class like Mage Knight or Sage if you want the mystical utility. Unlike Kagetsu though, the proficiencies Pandreo needs for reclassing are ones he either already has or can easily get, namely swords off Lucina for Mage Knight. Speaking of proficiencies, a great thing about Sage Pandreo is he has a blue proficiency in staves. Not much else to say about this guy, he's a great magic user, and on Maddening, you need great magic users to deal with the physically bulky later enemies.
Hard to stomach.
Oh, Bunet. He's a lot of people's least favorite character in every respect, but I guess he's basically Jade without needing a Master Seal. He's meant to be a tank, but as you saw last time, there are already hard-hitting enemies who double him, and this isn't even maddening. I would say he's an okay filler unit, but the Soul arc already gives you a ton of filler unit to a far better than he is. And he doesn't have a meaningful niche over Louis or Jade besides, again, not needing a Master Seal. Well, there is one niche Bunet has, but it's an incredibly silly gimmick and I only recommend it for fun. His personal skill, Seconds, gives him a luck % chance of getting another packed lunch whenever he eats one. If you inherit Celica's favorite food and a luck plus skill, you can theoretically have a Bunet who can spam engages, which is particularly useful with the Ring of the Instructor. The problem with this? Without spoiling too much, let's just say we don't get Celica back, and therefore her skill inheritance, for a very long time. So by the time Bunet can do this, the game is almost over. And again, it's just a silly joke build rather than anything good. For what it's worth, Bunet is the only character besides Anna who can make an SS dish in the dining hall, but that doesn't even require you to use him.
La 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 la.
Timerra is painful. I really like her character, but I can't deny that as a unit, she is very awkwardly designed. Timerra is meant to have a balance of strength, dex, speed, and defense, and on paper that sounds really good. But in practice, she suffers from a very mediocre damage output that takes a lot of effort and resources to fix. And even once you do, she's not particularly amazing. On top of a low-ish strength base and an unreliable 35% growth in her default class, she also has a terrible starting build for a lance user, losing significant speed from literally everything besides a slim lance. Now there is a DLC emblem that turns this into a strength, but that's yet another resource that may be better used elsewhere. Overall, Diamant did the all-rounder offense and bulk build a lot better than she did, and he's also around much longer. But starting with 150 SP is nice, as is her personal skill, which causes all enemies within 3 spaces to lose 5 crits due to their eardrums bleeding. You face low % crit rates fairly often in Engage, especially on low luck characters like Ivy, so this skill saves you more often than you'd think, especially if you're doing an Iron Man run. But apart from that, things haven't been great for Timerra. You might think you could fix her by reclassing, but here's the problem with that. Timerra's default promotion has something she really needs, and no, it's not the slight boost to growths, or even its base stats. It is the skill Sandstorm. Once Timerra has this, there's a dex % chance of every physical attack basing its damage off 150% of her defense stat instead of her strength. And since her strength is mediocre and her defense is pretty good, she's very reliant on this to do meaningful damage. And that's a problem because she has like a 20 to 30% chance of this per attack at best. And frankly, there are some enemies she struggles to kill even if she sandstorms twice. Some people give Alcryst flack for being reliant on Luna, but I find this even worse, since Alcryst's strength without Luna is fine most of the time, and he has flyer effectiveness to fall back on. Timerra lacks either of these, and this reliance on Sandstorm also kneecaps her reclassing potential, since she must be a picket to use it. I can see what the unit designers were trying to go for with Timerra, but it could have used a bit more refining. Which is a shame because I and a lot of other fans really like Timerra's character.
I must focus. Is that a rare critter?
Unlike Timerra, Merrin is pretty simple and generally agreed to be quite good. She's often described as a fire and forget character. She has strong base stats all round and starts in a pretty good class, and with a Knife Forge she can immediately contribute good offense, while also being fairly bulky for a unit of her speed. Her speed growth ensures she'll continue to be fast, while her balanced personal growths in defense and resistance keep her bulk decent. But the one issue Wolf Knight has is it doesn't boost her strength growth much, leaving her with a fairly weak 30%. Most people who use Merrin long-term like to reclass her out of Wolf Knight into something like Wyvern Knight or Warrior. Also, Merrin's personal base in magic is high for someone who starts in a physical class, and her personal magic growth is the same as her strength. This means she not only does well with Radiant Bows and Levin Swords, but she can even work in magic reclasses. Merrin's personal skill is also solid. This late in the game, you probably have 2 or more females on your team. And unlike Louis, those allies don't need to be adjacent, just within 2 spaces of Merrin, and for that, all 3 of them get +5 to hit and avoid. And 1500 base SP is also good enough to pick up a lot of nice skills. I feel like I haven't had a lot to say about Merrin, but that's because she's pretty simple. She's good in both the short term and long term, and is surprisingly versatile for reclassing.
Retribution is due.
Panette's personal base strength is among the highest in the game, and after factoring in her class, her overall base strength is the highest in the game. She also starts with incredible HP, and decent dex for an axe user. Her speed is a little iffy, but as I've said before, there are ways to work around it, either through Lin, other speed boosters, or making her so strong she only needs to hit once. And that's not difficult, as she's tied with Amber for the highest personal strength growth outside of DLC. She also has great HP, a good personal dex growth, and enough defense and speed personal growths to be fixed with reclassing. But what Panette is most infamous for is her personal skill, Blood Fury. It grants crit +10 whenever her HP is below max, and as you can probably tell, this stacks with Ike's Wrath. With those two and a Lin engraved killer axe, it's not uncommon for Panette to have a 100% critical rate. Which means, if given Vantage, she has essentially infinite durability against one-range enemies, as anything that tries to attack her will immediately die. I've said before that Engage is a player phase focused game. That kind of goes out the window when you're using the Ike-Panette combo. Some people consider it a beginner's trap and say that Panette is better with some other emblems. But personally, if you're new to Engage, and especially if you're new to Maddening, this is one of the easiest overpowered builds to make, and it will make your Maddening experience a lot easier. And for that reason, I recommend it. You generally don't want to stay in Berserker though. Warrior is common, and I've had success with Wyvern Knight Panette. Though Panette is a strange one to reclass because of her default proficiencies. For some reason, her blue proficiency is knives, not axes. I guess they wanted to have some kind of kinship between her and Merrin implied? Or they wanted you to make her a wolf knight? In any case, it's not hard to reclass her, but it does mean her axe rank isn't as high as it could be in classes like Wyvern Knight.
My time to shine.
I'd sum up Hortensia as the ultimate staff user. Like her sister, she has a personal flying magic class, but it's more focused on support than on damage. Her flyer movement lets her use healing and support staves from hard to reach places, and her personal skill aids in that even more by giving +1 range to healing staves. As for actual stats, Hortensia starts out pretty fast, has very good dex, which will come into play later, and massive resistance. Her magic base of 12 is low for a tome user, and her growth isn't enough to save it. She'll usually double attack most things, but don't expect her to one-round even armored enemies. She can provide occasional chip damage with regular tomes and thunder when she needs to, but that shouldn't be often. You want to use her for support and utility, not for attacking. And her personal promotion helps even more with that. Sleipnir Rider shores up her magic a little and makes her resistance even more overkill, but its main asset is its class skill at level 5, World Tree. This gives Hortensia a dex % chance to not consume a use anytime she uses a staff. And she has 22 dex at bare minimum in this class, so that's a lot of saved staff uses over the course of a run. With a little luck, she essentially multiplies the number of times you can use warp and rescue staves. And there's even an S-rank staff that fully restores everybody's engage meters but only has one use. And it's always a hype moment if World Tree triggers on this. Finally, because weapon ranks are tied to classes in Engage, a Master Seal gives Hortensia an S rank right off the bat, meaning she's always a useful utility character even if you don't give her any experience.
I'll lead. Dance with me.
Seadall is a dancer and the only one you get. By moving next to an ally who's already acted and selecting Dance, Seadall can let that ally act again, up to and including attacking. Although he joins a little late, this ability is insanely useful. It lets you cover more distance, have somebody kill 2 enemies in a single turn, heal multiple people, or in some cases, use an emblem ability and an attack in the same turn. No matter what your playstyle or team composition, Seadall is always useful, so it can be good to reserve a spot on your team of 12 for him. As dancing is his main asset, Seadall's stats don't really matter. As he levels up, he might be able to take hits from enemies, but don't expect him to do much combat. Especially since attacking on the player phase means he's not dancing. But his class is considered Key Adept, which means he can chain guard when that's more valuable than dancing, and it sometimes is. And can make use of emblems that benefit that class type. Lucina is particularly nice on him. Not only does that give 100% bonded shield if you need it, but it also lets Seadall contribute chain attacks for damage while still dancing. Another decent emblem would be Sigurd, if we had him, who massively increases Seadall's dance range and lets him get out of danger after dancing with Canter. You typically want to avoid emblems with skills you need to give up your turn for, like Corrin, but especially Byleth. You want Byleth on someone else, so Seadall can dance for someone, get refreshed by Goddess Dance, and then dance for someone else, giving you potentially 6 refreshes in one turn. Finally, note that Dancer is considered a special class like Thief, so can't reclass to second tier classes until level 21, not that you would ever want to reclass Seadall anyway, and that it learns its class skill at level 25. Special Dance means that not only does dancing refresh an ally's turn, it also gives them +3 to dexterity, speed, and luck.
Cuteness combined!
Okay, so Rosado joins in one of the best classes in the game without needing any seals. He also has high personal growths all around, including a 45% personal strength, which is equal to Amber and Panette as the highest non-DLC one in the game. That and 75% personal HP and 45% personal speed is a rare combination. He also has a great personal skill that makes him more accurate against over half the enemies in the game. But there's a catch. Rosado's personal base stats are very low, especially for a promoted class with an internal level of 17. His strength in particular is a huge concern. 7 personal strength is worse than Amber, who joined much earlier with the same growth, and a total of 16 strength on a Wyvern Knight at this point in the game is very weak. He's reliant on his high growths to get him out of this rut, but there are 2 problems with that. 1, his strength makes it hard for him to get kills and level up, and 2, it's a little late to be getting a growth-reliant character, especially one who starts promoted. Especially since more promoted characters will join past this point with far more appropriate base stats for their level. Rosado is a fun character though, and he's definitely usable if you put in the effort. And if you don't have a Wyvern Knight at this point, or you want another one, he does offer one without needing to use any resources. And his starting SP is enough to pick up some useful skills, or get 200 more to pick up a 2000 SP skill. And all of that might be enough for some people.
Ready for me?
Goldmary starts as a level 3 hero, and that alone makes her very good. Why? Because she's 2 levels off getting Brave Assist, and 200 SP and some Bond Fragments off inheriting Dual Assist Plus from Lucina. That alone makes her a very useful utility character for the rest of the game. She also comes with an abnormally high base defense for a hero, along with a 55% personal growth, the highest in the game outside of DLC. And male enemies get an additional -20 to their hit rate, making her quite durable while still providing chain attack support. And her blue proficiency gives her an extra lance rank as a hero. Now, you could make the most of her high defense growth and reclass her to General or Great Knight, and she does do decently in those classes, but to me, she does hero chain attack utility so well, it's a shame to give that up.
Are you taking notes?
Don't count Lindon out because he's an old man who joins late. If you have an extra slaw on your team by now, he's not a bad choice. He's able to put out decent magical damage with no investment at all, and use staves up to A rank as a sage thanks to his blue proficiency. His personal skill is also really good since from this point on, most enemies have silver weapons, and many good weapons are below A rank, including Olwen Thunder, the Levin Sword, and the Radiant Bow. Speaking of which, there's a silly Lindon build that can be surprisingly effective. You can reclass him to Sniper and use his starting SP to instantly inherit Draconic Hex. Then give him Lyn and the Radiant Bow, and Lindon can do serious damage to bosses while also debuffing them from 20 spaces away. Also, since killer weapons happen to be C rank, there are some gimmicky physical builds you can do with Lindon too, as 7 base strength is not horrible for someone who starts as a sage. In fact, it's 1 above Rosado. Overall, Lindon is not likely to be a mainstay powerhouse of your team, but if you have room, he's a very useful support member.
Time to crack skulls.
Saphir is the only default warrior in the game. This may be relevant during the Fell Xenologue. And since warrior is such a good class, that's a great asset. She can provide longbow chain attack utility with 0 investments, and her starting SP is enough to get Dual Assist Plus from Lucina and become even better at chain attacking. And while her base stats might not look as good as a trained warrior Panette or Amber, they're not bad, especially that speed and defense. And like Lindon, she has a great personal skill. This one synergizes well with Wrath builds. And speaking of skills, she already has Merciless for plus 50% damage against broken foes, which might be useful in combination with Fracture Staves against corrupted worms. She has no real standout personal growths apart from HP, which may limit her reclass potential, but when her default class is so good, who needs that? In the end, Saphir is a little similar to Goldmary. Being a low investment backup unit you can slot into an unfinished team to fill chain attack holes, but thanks to the strength from Warrior, she's a lot stronger at combat than Goldmary, and that might make up for her joining later.
This is my redemption.
Your army's deployment slots for the rest of the main story chapters increase by 1 when Morvia joins. This is probably so players who want to use him for story reasons aren't forced to bench someone. But it also means Morvia is essentially a free deployment from now on, as it's very unlikely you'll have someone who can fill that slot who's better than him. Morvia's personal base stats and growths are all very high, allowing him to do well in a variety of reclasses. In his default Royal Knight, he's very tanky, provides staff utility up to B rank, and can deal decent chip damage to enemies, though don't expect him to kill much. 2500 SP is also more than enough to get him kitted out with a lot of great skills. His personal skill works like Alfred's except raising defense by 2, which makes him even tankier. Morvia, interestingly, can be reclassed on Chapter 22's menu if you have a spare second seal by then, and he can fulfill the same role he normally does in Griffin Knight with the addition of Flyer utility. His high base stats in both strength and magic mean he can do decent damage with arts as a martial master if you want to go that route. He can reclass to warrior or hero and pick up Lucina's Dual Assist Plus if you want chain attack utility, or he could go Wyvern Knight or Mage Knight for an offense role. And with all-round good cap modifiers aside from speed and luck, you really can't go wrong with Morvia in any role.
I'm more than just a fell dragon.
Just like Morvia, your deployment slots expand by 1 once Vale joins, to a total of 14 for the rest of the main story chapters. So Vale is essentially another free deployment. Vale also has excellent personal base stats, though her growths are more lopsided than Morvia's, with deficits in HP and defense and somewhat mediocre speed, and her build is definitely a problem. But all of these can be worked around with the many tools Engage gives you by this point, especially with her massive starting pool of SP. Vale has a lot of exclusive assets. First is the Fellchild class, which gives her a class skill she already has the level for, that regenerates her engage meter by 1 every turn when it's not maxed. She also has her exclusive Dark Tome and exclusive Magical Dagger that still poisons, though her use of these is still restricted by class. Perhaps Vale's biggest asset is being another Dragon-type unit alongside Alear, meaning you have 2 people who can potentially run things like Corrin's all Dragon Veins or Byleth's all Stat Boosts. This pushes Vale into more of a utility role, as Fellchild's base stats are pretty low. If you want her to be a combat unit, she can do well if reclassed to Mage Knight, Griffin Knight, or even Wolf Knight for using her magical dagger. Just be warned that she won't be able to use her tome that way, just as she won't be able to use her dagger as a Mage Knight. Like Morvia, she's also one of the few with the base stats to do decent damage with arts. Her personal skill is a reversed version of Alear's, and while I prefer Divinely Inspiring, every little bit of damage helps, and the -3 damage taken can save you sometimes. Whether used for utility or combat, Veil is a major asset to the Divine Dragons team from this point on.
That's me for ya.
This world will find salvation.
Before I go into Nell's more unique strengths, I have to cover some traits the DLC Dragon Twins both share. Firstly, they are, of course, dragon units, so get all the extra benefits from emblems that Alear and Veil do. But unlike Alear and Veil, they have access to 5 special Dragonstone weapons. You can see their stats on screen here. Nell and Rafal each start with 1 Fellstone and 1 other type of Dragonstone. But how do you get the others? By refining at the forge, you can turn a Fellstone into the Fell Ruinstone. If you upgrade the Fell Slaystone, it turned into the Fell Waitstone. The Fell Ruinstone seems to turn back into the regular Fellstone, and the Fell Magic Stone turns into the Fell Slaystone, while the Fell Waitstone turns into the Fell Magic Stone. So there's no way you can ever screw yourself out of not having any one of these. They're also considered special classes, so they have a level cap of 40, and they can only reclass to 2nd tier regular classes after reaching level 21. Nell is a lance-wielding Fellchild with a nice balance of stats, leaning a little towards speed. I've sometimes seen her described as a power-crept Timerra, or less charitably, Timerra if she was actually good, and I can't really deny that. Her growths give good reclass potential, though that wastes her unique class assets. And her only starting proficiency is Lancers. This is a weird issue with the DLC characters, all of them only come with 1 proficiency, which makes reclassing take some effort. Finally, all DLC characters start with 2000 base SP. With access to the right emblems, you can grab some pretty strong skills quite early. Nell's personal skill, Protective, incentivizes you to use both her and Rafal in the same army, which is much easier now that Rafal is not pathetic.
I am awakened!
Sombron's heir no more. Rafal now helps us fight against him, or the alternate version of him at least. Despite its name, his version of Fellchild is different from Nell's, using axes and having different class growths. Stat-wise, Rafal focuses far more on offense and also tanking, having good bases in strength and defense, and great growth in those areas, both class and personal, along with a very good total HP growth. All that with a base speed of 16 and a growth of 40%, not bad for someone so strength and defense biased. Sure, his magic sucks, but were you really gonna use him in a mage class? His luck is also bad, fittingly for what he went through. The crits aren't much of a threat to him due to his HP and defense, though his low resistance could be a problem. His personal skill gives him plus 10 crit every time an ally near him kills a foe, which is easy to do. And though that axe he used in the Xenologue isn't exclusive to him, it does work well with this skill due to its high crit rate and being fairly cheap and strong to forge. Nothing more to say about Rafal, he's just all-round good.
For the Mage Dragon Tribe!
Celestia may be the best unit to come out of the DLC, and that's really saying something. She gets to keep her evil counterpart's personal Melusine class, meaning despite her personal growths being pretty good, and technically being decent for reclassing, it's a huge waste to move her out of this. It's basically Ivy, but trading staff utility for sheer power. Celestia has amazing balance-based stats and growth rates in magic, strength, dexterity, defense, and resistance, while also having incredible speed. In addition to her personal skill boosting the hit rate of allies every time she defeats a foe, which should be often, though being a flyer she'll likely be very far away from allies most of the time, she also gets a class skill out of Melusine that nobody else gets, Soul Blade. which calculates damage from swords using the average of the target's defense and resistance. Now this can mean she does less damage to physical enemies with Levin swords, but it might be worth it because it makes Levin swords reliable offense even against enemy mages, and since enemy mages have low HP, and she's often going to be doubling them, this makes her an all-round monster offensively. Sure, she doesn't start with tome proficiency for some reason, but again, why would you want to reclass her? Which leaves bad luck as her only real weakness. Celestia is incredible. Definitely use her extensively if you have the DLC.
Out of my way, please! I don't like pain!
Look at those base stats. Then realize you can have this guy as early as Chapter 7. Speaking of Chapter 7, I've often seen Gregory compared to Citrinne, just even more extreme. His magic and resistance bases and growths are out of the stratosphere, but his dex and speed have far lower bases and some of the lowest personal growths in the game. They would be the lowest if it weren't for one of his Four Winds compatriots. But as you probably know by now, there are many ways to fix speed in Engage, like Lin and Speed Plus Inheritance, and there are many ways to fix hit rate, like Engraving, Sigurd's Inheritance, and Divine Pulse. So really, these aren't as big of a problem for Gregory as you might think. His personal strength, HP, and defense growths are all also pretty solid for a magic user, so Mage Knight is also an option, as is Griffin Knight with Levin swords. And while he only has one starting proficiency, it's a blue one in Staves, letting him use Fortify and Entrap as a Sage. Really the biggest weakness I can see for Greg is a -2 speed cap, but the things you want magic users to fight generally don't have much speed anyway. Oh, and his personal skill I find kind of You don't really want him surrounded by enemies, and Pandreo's personal is pretty much the same thing but better. Overall, Gregory is very min-maxed, but in the best possible way.
How's this for praise?
If you believe you must be big in order to be tough, then you should get to know her. She'll teach you other stuff. So remember how I used to say a lot of characters had the best personal non-DLC strength growth in the game? That's because of Madeline. Her personal strength and defense growths are the best in all of Engage, at the cost of her dexterity and speed personal growths being the absolute worst. Her base stats are similar. Like Greg, she's very min-maxed. But she does everything a general is expected to do, just to the extreme! Virtually invincible to physical attacks, will die to a faint breeze of magic. Her personal skill encourages you to use her as a wall for your vulnerable allies. But as you can probably tell if you played the Fell Xenologue, being an axe general with dexterity this bad means her accuracy seriously needs help if you want to use her. Like I said with Greg, there are definitely ways to fix accuracy in Engage, but it will require some investment into engraves and skill inheritance. But her starting proficiency in axes, combined with her insane strength growth, means you could also go warrior for a true Unga Bunga build. Her personal strength base is actually 1 point higher than Panette's, though she is 5 internal levels above Panette, so that's not really saying much. Her speed and dex are going to be very bad in this setup, but she'll still have a 100% HP growth and 65% defense, letting her pull off the one-hit wonder Vantage Wrath build, while having some physical bulk to fall back on in case something somehow survives. Though this build won't leave you room to run any hit plus skills, so you'll need to rely entirely on engraves. But if you want an alternative to Panette or Amber with this setup, she can do it. Madeline's not my favourite character of the DLC batch, but she has her uses.